We need to keep a few things in mind when we are asked to label an IV bag. We're told that an IV has started at 1100 and it is infusing at 50 milliliters every hour. We need to be able to appropriately label this bag. The first thing we need to be able to do is to label the start time. That should be very clear of where that goes. That's going to go right at the top of the bag, and I would recommend circling that. The start time is at 1100. What we also need to be able to do is to label every hour. In other words, we need to, with a line, label the bag. Where is it going to be? Where is the medication, or in this case the dextrose? Where is it going to be every hour? So if we're starting at 1100, we need to think about where is it going to be at 1200, 1300, 1400, and we need to mark that with a line and time. And then finally, we need to be able to clearly label at the end what is the completion time. In order to do this, some students would start and have started where they just label and calculate the infusion time and completion time first, and then they go and label the bag. What I don't recommend doing is immediately just jumping into labeling the bag. Especially after seeing a few of these, many students feel that they have the idea of how to do it and then they go and label the bag. My recommendation in those situations is to first write some things down and then transfer that over to the bag. We have the time, we're concerned about the math, so let's focus on that. What I mean by that, we have 500 milliliters that's being infused, and it's being infused at 50 milliliters every hour. So what I know is, if this is the start time here at 1100, the 0, 100, 200, this is labeling. When we look at when this bag, it's going to be full, right? This bag's going to be full, and then it'll be draining. What this meter here is counting is the number of milliliters that have infused. So what I'm going to do is to continually add 50 milliliters until I get up to 500. So what I mean by that, here is 1100. I know I'm going to have to label 1 hour later, which in this case would be 50 milliliters. So at time 0, right, at 1100, 0 milliliters have infused. At 1200, 1 hour later, 50 milliliters, because that's the rate, has infused. Then another hour, at 1300, we add another 50, we know 100 milliliters have infused. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to just write down everything that I'm going to mark. I'm going to mark 0, 50, 100. I'm going to mark every 50 milliliters because that is the rate that it's going in every hour. So the reason I'm doing this, you might say, well, it should be pretty easy to mark 50 milliliters on those bags. That's correct. But if this were to change, say, to 60 milliliters per hour, or 65, or something that's not as nice as 50, it might be a little bit more complicated trying to just read it and mark it. So it might make sense to just list out what you're labeling. So I'm going to label 0, we already did that. 50, this is 50. 100, 150, 200, 250. So we're labeling every 50, and it should be very clear where these lines are. And then finally 500. And I'm going to, on each one of these lines, say what time it should be when the bag hits that point. So time 0, 50 milliliters later, this was 1200. Another hour later, this was 1300. So I'm clearly labeling every hour. Again, it should be very clear at what hour and at what point on the bag it is. When we get down to the very last piece, you're going to want to label the completion time and mark it with an arrow. Right? Label the completion time, and some people will write CT for completion time is 2100 at the end. So again, we labeled the start time, We wrote out every single hour. We're going to mark 0 up to 500 every 50. That's where the bag's going to be after every hour. And then we clearly labeled the completion time with an arrow. Although this seems like it's pretty straightforward, it can be a little bit confusing when we get to a point where maybe this was at 470. It's not an exact 50 milliliters. It could be 30 milliliters remain. So how can we think about how much time that is? Let's look at another example that's a little bit more complicated. In this problem, our IV is starting at 0015, and we are infusing at, not add, but at 300 milliliters per hour. We need to label the bag appropriately. So we know the first thing we want to do is label the start time, 0015. That's the start time. And I know I'm going to mark every hour. Well, what am I going to mark? Well, we are starting at 0 milliliters being infused. The next hour, an hour later, we know since we have a rate of 300 milliliters per hour, I'm going to have to mark 300. Then I'm going to have to mark another 300, so 600. Then another 300, which is 900. Now, if you were to add another 300, you would get to 1200. The problem is, and these are all milliliters, right? These are all milliliters. The problem is our bag is only 1,000 milliliters. So what's going to happen here is I can't mark 1200. I'm going to have to mark that 1,000. This is only a difference of 100 milliliters. We're going to come back to that. But I do know that at time 0 we have 0015. I also need to mark 300 milliliters, so that's going to be right here. I have to mark 600. I'm marking where it's going to be every hour, and then 900. And I'm going to mark these with what time it is. So at 0015, 1 hour later, right here would be 0115, right? We'll be at 300. Excuse me. Then at the other one, we'll be at 0215. And then 0315. So that's not so bad. And again, it may not be challenging to think about where it's going to be, but I highly recommend that you just write them out. 300, 600, 900. We're going up by that rate of however many milliliters per hour there is. Now the problem is, this is not going to be at 0415, right? Because we're not actually infusing an entire 300 milliliters. It's not going to be an entire hour. We need to figure out what is this time. Well, let's think about the distance here. We need 100 more milliliters to infuse, right? We need 100 more milliliters. That's what we said here. But 300 milliliters are going in every hour. So we can actually set up a proportion. I know that there are 300 milliliters going in every 1 hour. And I don't have an additional hour's worth of time here, because that's not a 300 from 900 to 1,000. It's not 300 milliliters, it's only 100. So every 300 milliliters is equivalent to 1 hour. We don't want 300 milliliters. We want to know that the equivalent time for 100 milliliters to infuse. So we can set up a proportion. If 300 milliliters is infusing in 1 hour, we want to know what is this time? How much time is going to elapse if I only want 100 milliliters? So we can cross multiply. We get 300x equal to, again, this is 100. And what you're going to get, if you put this in your calculator, you're going to get 0.33333333. 0.3 repeating. If you were to write this as a fraction, which I would recommend, you get 1/3. So we have 1/3 of an hour. We have 1/3 of an hour. So how can I figure out what 1/3 of an hour is? Or 0.333? Well, you can multiply that, 1/3 times 60, and that's going to give you the number of minutes. And what you'll get is 20. Now, all of this could be done this way, right? Thinking about, well, I do know there's 100 milliliters that need to be infused. 300 milliliters are infusing every hour. The other thing that you can do is to just write your proportion, not in terms of 300 milliliters over 1 hour, but you know that 300 milliliters are going to infuse over 60 minutes, right? That's the same as 1 hour. Why is that helpful? Well, because then we don't have to, up here we had to solve for hours, and then we converted hours into minutes. When in fact we can just start knowing that there's 300 milliliters infusing every 60 minutes. We're infusing 100 milliliters. We want to know how many minutes is that. So just by changing that 1 hour into 60 minutes, that allows me, in this case, to just solve this. You get 300x equal to, this is going to be 6,000, and you get x is equal to 20 for 20 minutes. So my point is this. We're eventually going to have to convert it to minutes. Do you want to first just solve it in hours and then convert it into minutes? Or if you can write our rate as 300 milliliters per hour, if you can write that as a certain number of milliliters over 60 minutes, then you can just solve the proportion, and your solution there in that proportion is going to be in minutes. The reason why I might recommend this bottom one here is because students will incorrectly, when they solve for hours, they will incorrectly round this to 0.3. Not 0.33333 repeating, but just 0.3. And if you take in your calculator 0.3 and only 0.3 times 60, you don't get 20, you get 18. And that would be wrong. So in this case, what students tend to do is they incorrectly round and then use that rounded number. However, with this one down here where I have stars, there's no rounding at all. We know that there are 300 milliliters infusing in 60 minutes. We need to figure out how many minutes are elapsed over that 100 milliliters. Keep in mind, I didn't even answer the question here. I mean, this is just part of it, the 20 minutes. What that's telling me here is that 900 to 1,000, that 100 milliliters, this is 20 minutes later. We have to figure out 20 minutes later. At 0315 was 900. 20 minutes later, we're going to be complete. We're going to be at that 1,000 milliliters. So 20 minutes later would be 0335. Again, when we're labeling the bag, we have the start time. We know we're going to label every 300 milliliters. So I wrote out 300, 600, 900. Now, from 900 to 1,000, that was only 100 milliliters. So we needed to figure out how much time that is. That's not enough to make up an hour. So you could write that at figuring out what that is in hours. That's definitely a fraction of an hour. Or we could, rewriting the rate as 300 milliliters per minute, figure out how many minutes that 100 milliliters would take, and then add that to the 0315.